Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers Podcast. Hello, and welcome back to me, Phil Craig, to the Scandal Mongers Podcast, and to my friend Skippy. Skippy's joining me. Andrew isn't with me anymore, as you know, but I do have Skippy. And he's joining me at the Australian bar today for our second anniversary of the podcast. Yay! What's that, Skip? Skip wants to know what's on the Australian bar today. Of course he does. Well, gin and Cointreau. The ingredients for what we call a furnace. Now, a lot of you actually rather more comments about the drink recipes than the content last week. That's not true, but there were quite a few. People wanted to know all about my damson gin recipe, which I have shared with some of you. But the furnace is a particular Craig family invention named for a little production company that I used to jointly own about 15 years ago. And a furnace is called furnace because of the colour. So you have gin, Cointreau, orange juice, and if you want to go really fancy, a little bit of raspberry puree in the bottom, so it looks like there's a glowing heart of the furnace. Gin, Grand Marnier / Cointreau, orange juice, bit of raspberry puree. There you are. This is how we live. Every day a new cocktail. Actually, now I'm on a three-day drinking week, which is Craig has me barred from the bar until I lose a bit more weight. But when we do drink, we do tend to go for fancy cocktails, don't we, Skip? Yep, yes we do. So, in the absence of Andrew and the presence of Skip, what to say? Thank you for your comments. Not a huge audience for Boeing. I didn't expect there to be. About a third of you listened or watched Clive talking about Boeing last week. I thought it was really fascinating. But about a third of you watched it compared to the previous week's show about the Kennedys. I guess I need to stick to more racy scandals if I want to build an audience. But that's some lovely comments. Fran330. What's really nice with this channel, Phil, she says, I assume it's a she, it's never just a scandalous story told for the sake of it. It looks at the why and the how and the depth of things, making the difference between proven facts and hypothesis. Thanks to you, Phil, and to your constant stream of great guests. Oh, lovely. Makes it all worthwhile. That and a nice furnace at the end of the day makes it all worthwhile. Vega of the Lyre. What a great name. Hi, Vega of the Lyre. Fascinating topic, Boeing, and an excellent interview as always. Shucks. Looking forward to next week, as my mum and I are currently reading Women in Intelligence, and she's enjoying it immensely. Yes, well, I should say what this present program is about. It's not really about my bar or cocktails. It's about women in intelligence. Indeed, this book that Vega of the Lyre and her mum are reading, it's written by Helen Fry. She'll be joining me shortly. If you don't like all this preamble, you can jump straight to the interview anytime you like to talk about her book, Women in Intelligence, which is really, really cool. And actually, I think I said last week it was more about the Second World War. I mean, there's a lot of great Second World War stories in it. I think most people will know that there were women spies in the Second World War. Some of them are quite famous. But what to me was really fascinating, and I'm going to talk to her about a lot, is the First World War. And indeed, even before that, and then in the interwar years, how very important women were in the world of intelligence. Now, some of them, risked their lives and lost their lives, doing all sorts of amazingly dangerous and exciting and brave things. So stick with me through my introductory remarks, and we'll get to Helen Fry. I'm sure Vega of the Lyre will be waiting for that. Final comment this week, Marianne Oz. I'm thinking you're from Australia, Marianne. Could be wrong. Thanks, Phil, for another great podcast. I learned so much about planes. Good. Somebody was interested in the planes, listening to this fascinating conversation. I do love the range of guests you invite. And I can't believe you don't have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. That makes two of us, Marianne. I can't believe it either. Although it has nudged up a little bit. Oh, and finally, and I really do want that damson gin recipe. There you are. I have commented on your remark with the damson gin recipe. And if anybody's interested, I might even put the furnace recipe up as well. Final thing to say before we get stuck into some scandalous content. I've become great friends with Shauna Kay from the Vintage Read. Well, I discovered, much to my pleasure, that I have another fan in Australia, Shauna's mum, Joy Bell. I was so pleased to hear this. So I just thought I'd give a little shout out to Joy Bell Look after your girl. She's a real little ripper, that's Shauna, as I'm sure you know. Anyway, I'm so glad you're enjoying it. And if you're listening or watching now, welcome. Okay, what's new in the world of Scandal? Oh, gosh, so many things that I want to talk about this week. Um, the Royals back in the news in Britain, slightly eclipsed by the American election, but it was a big story. The Sunday Times, which is one of the papers that tends to do big investigations here, delved into the duchies of Cornwall and Lancaster. These are the sort of, I think since like the Middle Ages, they're the personal property of the king or the queen and the prince or the princess of Wales. And royal finance is a touchy subject here. Britain's a funny place. I think there's a sort of egalitarian, though we have a monarchy, and we all have to bow and scrape, and get our gongs and our prizes, and go to Buckingham Palace garden parties. There's another side of the British character that is kind of quite antsy, and doesn't like to feel they're being taken advantage of. And the question of royal money has always been really sensitive, and so it looks pretty bad. What was revealed by the Sunday Times? I mean, not the fact that they own land. So what? They own land. A lot of people own land. A lot of big and aristocratic families still own land. So they take rent for that land. Well, so what? A lot of people do that, and they take rent from big companies, hotel chains, supermarkets. I don't think people are too bothered about that. But what the story brought out that wasn't quite so comfortable is that they take lots and lots of money in rent from public services, especially the NHS, which is like a national religion here. I mean, if you ask most British people to weigh the NHS against the royal family in terms of what they value, it'd be an interesting conversation, an interesting poll to have. The NHS is incredibly popular. It's flawed. A lot of people think it needs reform, but it's kind of been there for us our whole lives. And by and large, certainly in my experience, it still does deliver amazing care without the worry or the concern about payment. Anyway, it turns out the NHS has been giving millions and millions to the king and the prince through rent for things like hospitals, ambulance stations, all sorts of facilities that support the NHS. It's not just the NHS, it's prisons, it's fire services, it's St John's Ambulance, lots of charities. Some of these are charities that the royals support, but then they're paying the royals money. And I don't know, it's probably not the biggest scandal in the world, but it brings back memories. I don't know if those of you who are of a certain age will remember the famous Annus Horribilis the Queen talked about. Well, a big part of that year was that after the fire at Windsor Castle, it came out that the royal family didn't pay income tax. And yet they wanted the state to help, rebuild this expensive castle. And that created quite a row. It really did. And in the end, the royals did start paying income tax. And maybe now this new row, I think they need to think hard about perhaps having exemptions for certain public services so that they don't doesn't look like they're profiting off things like hospitals, especially during the sort of hard times in which we're living today with various welfare cuts. It doesn't look good, and they need to do something about it, in my opinion. America. Oh my goodness. I wasn't going to talk much about this, but I kind of want to. I'm sure most people listening are like, oh, I'm going to skip now. I've heard too much about this election. But it touches on things that actually we have talked about on this podcast. Things to do with the left. And I would probably still identify myself as being on the left, centre left. In most of my life, I was a member of the Labour Party for a long time. I was active in the party in the 90s. I had a role, a small walk-on role in the kind of Blair era at the beginning of it. And once I actually got into the final shortlist of 3 to be the director of communications for the Labour Party. That was a big job. That was a job that Peter Mandelson had. And I got onto the shortlist to replace him. I didn't even go to the final interview. I decided it wasn't for me. I was going to stick with television. Who knows how my life would have changed had I got into that interview. Probably wouldn't have got the job, but if I had, I would have been part of the Blair Revolution and New Labour. That would have been exciting. So yeah, I guess I still think of myself as being somebody on the left. And I'm no fan of Trump. I've talked about this before. I think he's a bully. I think he's a braggart. I think he's a bit dangerous. I think he's a loudmouth. I think lots of bad things about him. I wanted Harris to win. I would have voted for Harris. But I'm also kind of angry about Harris and about the way she was picked. the whole background to that just seems off. I know I'm not American, but I've spent a lot of time in America. I've visited the country hundreds of times. I do take an interest in American politics, American life. Got a lot of American friends from all sides of American politics. What were they thinking, guys? What were they thinking? Lying about Biden for all those months. We could absolutely see he wasn't capable anymore. They left it too late to replace him. They brought her in without any kind of policy arguments or any sort of debates or any primary process. And it was very obvious very quickly that she was a rotten candidate. I'm sorry if you're still mourning her, for those of you who are mourning her. She was a rotten candidate. She couldn't do interviews. I mean, she couldn't communicate. She spoke about joy at the beginning of her campaign, and she had a little moment. There were some funny things about, childless cat ladies. It looked for a while like they were getting a bit of a groove on. But then every time she sat down to talk about the campaign, she seemed defensive and inarticulate and very, very prickly and just not a good communicator. And then to make things worse, they chose somebody as the vice president who was even worse than she was. I mean, he really was a disaster. So speaking as somebody in the communications business, that vice president debate he had with Vance was horrific. I mean, the Democrats must have been watching it through their fingers. It was so terrible. And, her big problem, I don't know that much about American politics, but I know one of her problems was she's seen as a Californian liberal. So middle America may be a little suspicious. So why don't you pick, I don't know, the governor of a really important state like Pennsylvania, who is articulate and popular and upbeat and positive, a man called Shapiro. Pick him as a VP. It's so obvious. They didn't. Why didn't they? Well, that's another story. The suggestion is it's because he's Jewish. I mean, it takes you to a whole other layer of things and arguments that are raging. I mean, but if that was the reason, it was a terrible decision because he would have been brilliant. And I've seen him do lots of brilliant interviews and debates. And he has that kind of sense of joy about him and positivity that Clinton had, that Obama had, that, Harris didn't have and Waltz didn't have. Plus, Waltz was associated, in the minds of a lot of people with the far left of the Democratic Party. And that was, that was Harris's problem. So, yeah, it went on. It was like a lot of word salad. A lot of people have said it was joyless. It was angry. People felt patronized by it, by them. I think a lot of people have voted against her, but didn't really necessarily vote because they loved Trump. I'm betting a lot of people who voted for Trump didn't like him at all, but it became almost a pleasure, I think, on the centre-right to oppose her. And the way that campaign went and how angry it got. Opponents are Nazis, our opponents are garbage, our opponents are bad people. Guys, you do not win elections like this. So I think a lot of people didn't vote for Trump, in my view. They voted against what the Democrats were offering. They voted against that whole, if you don't agree with me, then you're my enemy mentality, This obsession with groupthink, with groupthink. The differences of opinion make you a phobe or a racist or a Nazi. And this obsession with identity politics has grown so toxic, and you think of the left now, the left that I remember, and it still exists, of course, is about rights and freedoms, and it's funny and it's cool and it's forward-looking. And it was the reactionary right who were the old farts, angry, red-faced men, reactionaries, bigots. They were the cruel ones, but that's somehow pivoted. I mean, I don't like Trump, I've said this, but you look at someone like Musk or even Vance, they're about the future, aren't they? They whether you agree with them or not, they seem to have a vision, an enthusiasm, a positivity about technology and about change. And then you look at, I don't know, Antifa. You look at angry people in black masks demonstrating, shouting, waving terrorist flags sometimes. And I know that's not Harris, but there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who kind of give cover to that behavior and are happy to sort of support it. So, yeah, it became pretty toxic. Trump was very beatable, I think. But I think he was very beatable with the right candidate and the right message. But they screwed it up. And I think it's a bigger deal this than 2016 because it's not only does he have more power because of the successes in the Senate and the governors, It just feels like more of a cultural realignment, and the left has to listen. I've seen this in my own industry, well, former industry in television, the groupthink thing, the kind of anger at disagreement. It's boring, it's dull. There's a network of conferences that I used to go to. I was on the board of some of them, where TV producers meet and debate. One of the most famous and most fun is called the World Congress of Science and Factual Producers. I used to be on one of its boards. And my memory of it, and I'm only talking 10 years ago now, or 10, 15, was you'd get a lot of very smart people, and there was some real debate about the really big issues of the time. And all sorts of opinions were aired, and all sorts of programs were commissioned and made. And I just felt it's all closed down. It's all become more stale, a consensus. And, one really good example of that would be COVID. If you remember earlier podcasts, I mentioned this more than once. My old employer, the ABC, there was a hot mic incident, and various reporters were overheard saying that they dismissed this Chinese lab leak theory, largely because their ideological opponents, as they saw it, on the right, namely Trump, but also other Australian journalists who are conservatives, they had been, putting forward this theory, and so the ABC, and we're talking about, some of the most important reporters in a whole country, had said, no, it can't be true, it's rubbish. And actually, the longer time goes on, the more that theory looks plausible, maybe even likely. Did a whole program on it. But, groupthink, closing down debate, it's not about what's happening, what evidence I can find for a story. It's about what they think, and they're wrong and they're bad. And like I say at these conferences, what's the biggest scientific story of the last 10 years? It is COVID, isn't it? And I've checked on the site, tell me if I'm wrong, if any of my old TV producer friends are watching. Never once has there been a debate about this subject. Never once. At the globally most significant meeting of science documentary makers. Never once. And I have to wonder whether that's partly because they take sponsorship from China. At least I think they do. If you don't, I'll apologize, but I think you do. It's not just about the money. I think it's about the consensus. It's about, well, we can't talk about that because that makes us Trumpy. But it doesn't. It makes you journalists. It makes you storytellers. And if you don't open your minds to other opinions, and if you just stay in your little circle of everybody agrees with me, your little warm bath of what everyone else thinks, then nobody will watch your programs. You'll become completely marginalized. And I suspect we've seen a little bit of that in America at this election. People are just not tuning into mainstream media as much as they did. They're turning on the podcasts. They're listening to Joe Rogan. They are. And I think this is a problem for the left. I'm not saying all TV producers are the left, but, let's face it, a lot of them are. And even if they're not, they're kind of happy, I think, and I've seen this growing in my time in the industry, they're happy to kind of just go with the flow and not make waves. But it's the making the waves that make the great programs. At the ABC, I talk about my time at the ABC a lot because I had such a great time there. I was determined to get Andrew Bolt. Now, any Australian will know who Andrew Bolt is, but if you don't, he's a very right-wing pundit, a very angry right-wing pundit. He hates the ABC, hates public broadcasting, works for Murdoch. And I was at the ABC. We get attacked by the Murdoch press all the time, and I was always having rows with some of their columnists, defending my output because they were like caricaturing it as lefty drivel. It wasn't. But I wanted to do, and I'm interested in debate. I wanted Andrew on the ABC. And I met with him. I said, "You're the ABC's loudest critic. Come on a show." And I got him to do a show about 10 years ago about Indigenous rights, where he basically debated Linda Burney, who I think now is the minister in the Labour government for Indigenous rights. It was a fascinating program. And they both agreed that the other could take, Andrew could take Linda somewhere to show her something that he felt was important. And he agreed to go to places that she wanted, including New Zealand, where they talked about a treaty between Indigenous people and colonial authorities back in the day. And that argument actually about treaty and about the Aboriginal Indigenous voice, has only become more important in the years that passed. And I'm really glad that I got Andrew on the ABC. I don't much like the guy. I think he's very unfair, but it was a good program. and there was real debate. And it's the lack of that in my industry. It's the groupthink that I think is a factor in what we're seeing in the world. People turning away from left liberal views and just dismissing as being angry. We're not owning the future. We should own the future. We always used to. We can't cede that to the right, or Trump will be in forever, or rather Vance will, because he's pretty good, isn't he, at what he does. So I hope the Democrats sort themselves out. And I hope that the wider kind of media community realizes it can't live in an echo chamber for any longer. Gosh, that was a rant. But that's what I feel. And it's my podcast now, just me and Skippy. Shut up, Phil. Get to the point. Okay, yes, the point will be coming now. It's Helen. I don't think you need an introduction. She's a really, really brilliant writer, great communicator. She's written lots of terrific books. This is her latest. And I hope you find it really interesting. Second World War is very much my thing. I've already asked Helen for a few hints and help on my upcoming book, which I try to mention every week. And there is one more thing. Actually, the Australian bar, look, this morning, came now says it had fallen off. It hadn't broken. This is the only original artwork. Well, actually, there's 3. Got them somewhere in the Northern Territories. They're beautiful, aren't they? The only original artwork I've ever bought. Mrs. Craig and I've ever owned. So it fell off in the night. So I don't know whether it's a poltergeist or a sign. Anyway, maybe the sign is to get stickier plastic attachments, which is what I'm going to do. Anyway, enough about me, enough about the bar. Let's talk to Helen. I'll see you later. Helen, welcome to the Australian bar and to Scandal Mongers.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Yes, it's my homage to the homeland of Shauna, who I think you spoke to recently on the Vintage Read.
I did. It was great fun.
Oh,
yeah, I
fun.
loved doing the podcasts.
Yeah, I used to live in Australia too, so that's my story. But what a great book. Thank you for joining me to discuss it. I had the sense reading it that you really, really enjoyed the research.
I always enjoy the research. It's fascinating because you don't really know what you're going to uncover when you start out. You think you have an idea and you know where some of the material is, but when you start reading it and going into the detail, you think, oh wow, that kind of begins to change our understanding of, in my case, Second World War, and sometimes I've been working on the First World War as well.
I love the story about doing a Zoom call to Canada in the middle of COVID with a 100-year-old.
I know she was better at the technology than I was. Oh, she was so bright. I mean, it's quite difficult, I think, to interact with someone in those early days on Zoom.
Yes.
And at the age of 100, transatlantic. And it was like I was sat in the room with her.
No, I was lucky enough to do a lot of interviews with veterans, but they were mostly about 20 years ago. They're kind of in their late 70s and 80s. But there were still quite a lot of them around. Now, of course, very few and far between and really, really old.
Yeah, most of them have gone. Yeah.
But I did find, I will get to World War II soon, but I did find the early sections of your book about the First World War and the kind of origins of female spies and female intelligence workers so interesting. I didn't really know the full story of Edith Cavell, to be honest. I really didn't. I had this sense that she was this kind of victim, and you really give her agency. That yes, she was a spy, but she was a master spy.
She absolutely was. And I'm doing some more research on her now at the moment. So I probably won't speak beyond what's already in the book. But I realised that if I'm going to write about the women, and it hadn't really been done before, we have lots of stories of the women behind enemy lines in France in World War II. But if you look at women broadly in intelligence, it hadn't really been done. And that's not why I did it. I did it because there was that moment when I thought these stories would never be told, the unusual stories I uncovered. But I realised I couldn't just dive in at World War II. And that's exactly, your comment that you found World War I fascinating. It is as fascinating as the Second World War material. And it's, missing from most accounts.
Well, it's funny because I think we've come in recent decades to see World War I in a very different way to World War II. It's not seen so much as a just war. We've all read the poets and we've seen Blackadder, and we tend to believe that a lot of the sacrifices that were made then were in vain. But so we undervalue, I think, the idealism and the courage especially of the women you talk about who were working behind enemy lines. I'd love you to share a few stories of the
Mm.
sort of amazing things they did and how brave they were. I mean, you mentioned Gabrielle Petit, I think, at one point.
Oh, yes, Gabrielle Petit. Yes, so she's heading her own intelligence network. And she was one of the ones, in fact, that she said quite openly she feared the firing squad at dawn. And they knew that if they were captured, ultimately they would face the firing squad. And some of them were quite reluctant, but they overcame that fear. And they thought, no, we're in the right place to gain intelligence for the British that will make a difference. And I think we just get an insight into the amount that I've been able to write in this book. And I'm doing further work on World War One, that where would we be without the intelligence that was gathered by these, well, it was the men and the women, but huge numbers of the women, because the men were fighting, well, they should be on the front line. So they were very visible if they're cycling around and behind enemy lines. So it was very difficult to use men of, we couldn't use men of fighting age. But so the women were absolutely crucial, and they are invisible. And ultimately, as you know, Gabrielle Petit did face that firing squad at dawn in 1916. Yeah, she sacrificed her life, and incredible. Where would we be without the work that
Yeah.
they'd done?
And we forget how brutal the occupation of Belgium was, and a lot of Belgian stories in your book, and people
Yes,
risking their lives to try and help the Allies liberate their land. It's just as valuable, it's just as idealistic as the Second World War, I would say.
it is. And Belgium's been sort of missed in accounts of World War One and World War Two. It's probably not surprising in that some of the files are only recently being declassified and still currently being declassified. My understanding is some of the intelligence files are going to take 5 years,
Crazy.
roughly. They can be out there, you can consult them, but they obviously have to be released into the Belgian National Archives. And I think we're going to start to have a different understanding of both world wars with material from these particular countries. And I have colleagues who've been working in archives in Denmark, Germany, of course. And I think the fact that British historians, and I'm sure historians of other nationalities are doing the same, is actually to work on documents from other countries is giving us a deeper and richer understanding of those conflicts.
Do you have a particular favourite World War One spy?
I know I'm often asked that. It's really difficult because I think they're all truly inspirational in their own way. But I'll be naughty and I'll pick one for you today. I won't say she's my favourite, okay, because I think that's not fair for the other women. But World War Two, yes, there was a British woman who went on to marry a Hungarian count. He was a diplomat. So she took on his surname Miska. So she was Baroness Miska, originally British, as I said. And she was the only spy swap of the Second World War that we know about in currently declassified files. And that for me was a wow moment because I've discovered it quite accidentally. I thought, oh, it's clearly she'd been involved in some kind of espionage. I thought, oh, I'll pull her file up. And then realizing that she's the only spy swap of World War Two at the moment. I mean, she may well be the only one, there may be more. And we think of that in the Cold War, don't we? The whole Glenica Bridge, the spy swaps, and they're men. They're men that are swapped. And to find that it was a woman, she was so valuable. She was an SIS, otherwise known as MI6 officer agent that went between Istanbul into parts of Hungary and Austria. Incredibly brave, was captured by the Gestapo, had a pretty rough time. And then in the Cold War, she wants to go back and do this kind of work behind the Iron Curtain. And she's told, no, you've done enough. You've had she was clearly physically affected by her treatment by the Gestapo. But of course, she didn't fare too well after 9 years in a Soviet jail either. She survives, an utterly incredible woman.
Well, no, there are so many stories of amazing women, incredibly brave women in your book. And it's quite funny that when the First World War is over and we get into the interwar years, you spend quite a lot of time describing their struggle for equal pay, which is probably familiar to a lot of women listening to this. They weren't treated the same as the men.
Well, it's an interesting discussion because what I didn't want to do was to fill up too much of the book with that age-long discussion about pay and how they were treated. But there is a very interesting paper which was being declassified, MI5 file, so our security service. And there's a debate in the 1920s about giving women equal pay for the same job, the same intelligence work that they're doing as the men. They're doing as good, if not better, job, it says. And throughout this period and both world wars, I discovered there were men who supported the women, who were not necessarily our stereotypical understanding of how they treated the women, that they wanted a more equal role because they recognized their skills. And so many of the women did their intelligence work, not, irrespective of gender. They were the right person for the job. And that's, again, a myth. We kind of need to start busting that myth, that these women were just hidden for so long by official secrecy. And we've made huge assumptions of women, as you know from the book, as secretaries, clerks, drivers. They most certainly weren't. In a lot of the cases that I suddenly uncovered, they're running spy networks and invisible ink and all of that stuff. But who would believe it,
Well, one of the most colourful stories in the book, it's something that I'm fascinated by, so I want to talk to you about this a lot, is the Tyler Kent case, or I should maybe call it the Anna Volkov case. And I've been really fascinated by this, and there are parts of it that are still not explained. So could you give the audience who will not know what I'm talking about a brief description of what I've just raised?
Yeah, it's a case that still deserves so much more research. So the files of this case have now been declassified, the MI5 files. And during the 1920s and 30s, it was, a threat to the UK, the communist threat, Soviet spies embedded, well, not just across Europe, but in Britain. So the security service was tracking them, and into the 1930s as well as the right-wing groups, the fascists. And they used women to infiltrate this group. And in this case, Anna Volkov, who ran the Russian tea rooms. There's a wonderful photograph of these tea rooms in London, and it became quite a socialite scene. And MI5 managed to get a couple of our women really close to her and to realize that she was actually working against us.
Yeah, so there are these right-wing sympathizers. There's the Right Club, the Russian tea rooms. Some people even suggest shadowy links to members of the British aristocracy who were kind of sympathetic to Hitler. And these two incredible spies, female spies, I think it's Joan Miller and Helen de Munck, are sent to kind of basically go behind the scenes, pretend to be sympathetic, pretend to be friendly to this woman, Anna Volkov. And they unearth this amazing story of this cipher clerk called Tyler Kent, who's working at the American Embassy. Do you want to take up the story, or shall I carry on?
No, you're doing a good job. I mean, he's basically passing secrets, isn't he, across to the Soviets, and that's how they managed to uncover it. And he stands trial for it and is found guilty. I mean, it was a big deal at that time.
But the suggestion at the time, and this is why it's still quite controversial, is that the ambassador was Joe Kennedy. Tyler Kent worked for Joe Kennedy. It's well known that Kennedy was not necessarily as sympathetic to the Nazis, but he was a pragmatist. He thought that he was talking about running for president as the man who could deal with the Nazis. Anyway, Tyler Kent gets arrested. There's a trial. It's all very embarrassing. And at that point, Joe Kennedy's plans to run for office stop.
Oh, absolutely. This cost him the presidency, you could say. And it would be his sons that he'd have to go on and support to become presidents, as we know, JFK and Bobby. So, yeah.
Is that because of the action of these intrepid women's agents, he's now exposed as somebody who's been dealing with information he shouldn't have been dealing with, and it kind of ruins his national security credentials? I mean, it's still a bit of a mystery what Churchill had over him.
Yeah, and I haven't studied Joe Kennedy himself and the involvement in this case in detail. I was looking at these women that were infiltrating the organisation. But my dear friend Susan Ronald has written a biography of Joe Kennedy and uncovers that angle. We obviously have to limit some of what we put into the book, because you can write a whole book just on that case. In fact, it does deserve a lot more research. But you're right, there were a number of British aristocrats and some American businessmen and industrialists. I mean, Hitler, Susan Ronald argues, couldn't have got into power really, or sustained his power, without the Western industrialists who were sort of propping him up. So I think it's a very kind of murky situation.
Well, I love it. You paint a
I've
great picture of this woman, Anna Wolkoff. She thinks that Joan Miller's her friend, because they've been drinking tea and exchanging all kinds of suspicious conversation in these tea rooms. And suddenly at the Old Bailey, Joan Miller turns up to give evidence against her, this British agent.
Yes.
She starts screaming across the Old Bailey at her.
I know, it's really dramatic scenes in the Old Bailey. And of course, that blows her cover. Joan Miller can't work, which this is probably, the biggest case she could possibly, well, who knows.
Well, she might have stopped an appeaser becoming the president of the United States. It's quite possible she did,
Yeah, it's a big story. It's a huge story. And it's a woman. It's one of our women working in intelligence, completely hidden.
I know, and going, sort of masquerading, just impersonating somebody else and getting away with it. No, classic spycraft. I love it. I mean, for all you talk about in the Second World War, all the analysts, the translators, the code breakers, women looking at surveillance photographs and listening in on wiretaps. Was their experience different to the men they worked alongside because they were women? Were they bringing something new to those jobs, do you think?
It's really hard to say because the files don't tell us that. What we can say is they start to step up and do jobs in a traditionally male world. And the female interrogators are one of the key examples of that. The first known female interrogators used in wartime from 1941, naval intelligence lot, typical of the naval intelligence lot, recruited by Fleming. That we absolutely know. We've got a photograph of them with Ian Fleming in front of what was a secret house in World War II, Latimer House. So they were chosen because of their ability, because we knew psychologically it would destabilize those prisoners. They're expecting a male interrogation. I mean, it's flipping everything on its head. And some of the most fearsome interrogators or brilliant interrogators turned out to be women. Women like Vera Atkins, who sent the female agents and the male agents behind enemy lines into France in the war, ends up investigating the deaths of her agents. And she goes on to interrogate some of the worst die-hard SS officers and camp commandants. And incredible that they would turned out to be so good. And the intelligence services appear to be using women from World War I and possibly even before World War I. I didn't go before that, but right the way through because of their abilities. So we've inherited this view that they're secretaries or whatever they are, but they're not. They're doing work equal to the men.
Brilliant. Well, I love the story of Sarah Churchill's daughter. You can explain why she takes it so seriously. Well, I must tell your story for you.
Yes, this is a fabulous one. Sarah Churchill, the second daughter of Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister, and she's visiting him at home. She's gone off on weekend leave. She's working as a photographic interpreter. She's working in other kinds of aspects at a site called RAF Medmenham. So there's aerial reconnaissance photographs that they're analysing. The women were brilliant at it, working alongside the men. And Churchill, it's sort of 1 a.m, and Churchill's pacing the study, and she's sat by the fireplace in the wingback chair. It's cold, it's early November, just a few days into November. He's pacing up and down saying, I've got 643 ships. You can just imagine his voice. Can't quite do a Churchill impression, but 643 ships heading to the coast of North Africa. And she pipes up, 644. And he says, how do you know about Operation Torch, which, of course, was the code name for the Allied landings in North Africa in November 42? Oh, she says, I've been working on it for weeks. Well, you haven't told me. He said, why didn't you tell me you were working on this? And she said, because I'm not allowed to tell anyone.
That's such a great story. Can't tell the Prime Minister, your own father.
Well, she'd signed the Official Secrets Act, and they really took it seriously. I mean, they had to.
No, well, it's still extraordinary to me. We talk about The World at War, for example, as the great documentary series of the Second World War. And in many ways, it was. But that was made in the early 70s before anything about Bletchley Park was known. And the people, and a lot of them were women, kept that secret for 30 years.
Yeah, it wasn't just the women, though. I interviewed some of the secret listeners. They were all male secret listeners who wouldn't talk. There weren't many left by the time I came to the story. Most of them passed away. But, they wouldn't talk about it or even recount their memories, however, faded they might be, until they knew those files had been declassified. But in the case of the women, some of them still won't talk, even though they know the files have been declassified. It's an extraordinary situation.
No, it's hard to put ourselves in their shoes. It must have been thrilling. Well, however, rich your life had been before, to be just ushered into this secret world. So we're going to tell you things now that you must never speak of again. Things that could actually help win the war. It must have been very exciting and life-changing, I imagine, for some of them.
Well, yes, and some of their work would be quite mundane. That many of the women in uniform, many of the men doing intelligence work, the analytical stuff could be quite mundane, long hours for the secret listeners, long hours when they're listening into conversations. So there is that side as well. But I think it did change them. It gave them something different, that gave them a bond, and in many between each other. But in many cases, what I discovered about the women, which we haven't really focused on historically before, is that many of them went on to have a 20 or 30-year career, sometimes 40 actually, in intelligence. Some of them started way back in World War One, and they're working, particularly if it's the civilian agencies, MI5 and what we today call MI6, or the Secret Intelligence Service. They're working through the 20s, the 30s, and they're doing secret work in World War Two. One of the women, her daughter, said to me, "My mother was a career spook." Well, I wasn't allowed to use the word spook in the book because it's anachronistic. But she had a 30, 35-year career in intelligence, working for what today we call MI6. And she never told her daughter about what she did. I've got a few snippets of stuff that has emerged because they've been in Foreign Office files, but we still largely don't know what they did. And traditionally, we've thought of women not being MI6 heads of station abroad. And what that means, of course, is they are managing a sort of MI6 station undercover, normally in a British passport control office, but not always, sometimes in an embassy. And it's always men. Except I discovered two women who headed MI6 stations in the Second World War.
Wow.
One out of Tangier, one out of Lisbon. It's like, we can no longer make assumptions, I think, about what the women did or didn't do. They didn't become the head of this until then, or whatever. But actually, as more is declassified, I think we're going to have a deeper understanding. And that's why I find these stories so inspirational. And incidentally, those two women that were MI6 heads of station in World War II, we know precious little about them. There's virtually no paper trail, so we still can't know the fullness of their career or how long they served. But I did think it important to include them in the book, to put them on record. That is an important step. It's the first step to their recognition.
I was interested. I mean, the Special Operation Executive, the SOE stories. I guess I knew some of the more famous ones about people operating in France and some of them who were captured and executed. But what I didn't know until I'd read your book was this was happening all the way from Norway to Istanbul. That these
yes.
SOE were using women in the field where their lives were very much at risk.
They were. And some of them were also, they had a cover unit of the SOE and were doing secret missions for the Secret Intelligence Service, otherwise known as MI6, that also had a branch, Intelligence School 9, part of another branch of military intelligence, MI9, that was sending male and female agents into the Balkans, into Yugoslavia, trying to penetrate Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, get up resistance movements. Very, very difficult because they were surrounded, of course, by German forces. Incredible stories. And the SOE, you're quite right, famously the French section everybody knows about. But some of the women were parachuted into Belgium, others were parachuted into, as I say, parts of Yugoslavia, and it was the women, some former, no, they weren't former at that time, sorry, Secret Intelligence Service women, MI6 women, who'd had a long-standing career in Vienna in the 20s and 30s, went on to head the German and Austrian section of the Special Operations Executive. I mean, when I say head them, they weren't the chief of that section. They were like the deputies. So it's probably inaccurate to call them to head it, but they basically did head the section because they did all the work. They recruited, trained the women and some of the male agents as well. And they organized, planned their operations, saw them off on their missions behind enemy lines into Austria and other parts of that area.
And were they armed? Were they sort of trained to fight, or were they expected to sort of hide behind a hedge or something? The Germans.
No, they had exactly the same training as the men. So they would go through the various training schools of SOE, and then they would go to the finishing school, Bewley, of course, being famously one of the finishing schools. They were trained in armed, unarmed combat. Yeah, they had to shoot. They had to do all kinds of scenarios. Exactly the same training as the men.
I once met Nancy Wake.
Did you?
In her final years when she lived in the hotel, was it the Stafford Hotel at St James's? She was pretty scary in her 80s, I have to tell you. She was a fierce woman.
That gives you an idea, doesn't it?
Well, she was certainly one of those who was trained to kill. I think rather enjoyed it.
Yeah, there is something about the kind of sort of strong iron character of these women. I think so many of them were like that, and yet they could also be your best friend. You know, they would enjoy their cocktail parties and socializing, but underneath, yeah, they were killed to defend the secrets of their country. I mean, amazing.
Yeah. Well, a lot of them, like Nancy, actually, I shouldn't make jokes about her. I mean, she was fantastically brave and successful, but she had a very personal reason to want to kill Nazis because she'd seen what had happened to all of her friends in France, especially her Jewish friends, and that's why she volunteered to fight. And there's some really strong Jewish characters in the book as well. It must have been very, very particularly scary to go behind enemy lines or to even work in intelligence at all.
It is, but they, of course, have fluency in German and sometimes in multiple languages. So, yeah, they were prepared to do their bit and they weren't going to let others do the fighting for them. But you're right, it was very, very risky for them as Jews because they would be treated as traitors and not as prisoners of war. But then if they were parachuted in civilian clothes as a secret agent, then they could be killed anyway. They were not protected by the Geneva Convention, but some of them went behind enemy lines in uniform. Some of them are smuggling out intelligence or helping our guys to escape from behind enemy lines back to the UK. If they're caught even in uniform, then they would not be treated as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention.
Well, I know it's not the subject of your book, but I wonder if you came across any of the did the enemy use women agents? Were the Nazis using women agents, trying to get them into Britain? Were the Italians using women agents?
It's a really difficult one to research. I think there are lots of, mirrors and shadowy, doorways here, because we ran, as you know from my book, a double agent system using women as well. So you don't just have Garbo and Agent Zigzag, the famous ones, the men. You also have a whole raft of the women. Most of their files still haven't been declassified. So the Germans used them as agents against us, not realizing they were really working for us. They did some fabulous deception work ahead of D-Day. Now, we gave them so many brilliant double agents, male and female, that the Germans decided not to create a separate or even attach onto them their own. They didn't then go out and recruit their own agents, double agents. They said, well, this is brilliant. Now, you're probably thinking of the likes of Coco Chanel, famously, who was thought to have been working for the Germans, sleeping with high-ranking Nazis. We have a history of a lot of women that did that. Who are they really working for? We might now ask, because in Coco Chanel's case, a recent exhibition in London, it says, towards the very, very end, she also worked for the French resistance.
Yes, I know. Anne de Courcy, her biographer, was on the podcast a few weeks ago. I
Yeah.
love Anne, and she was telling. I think she felt that basically Coco was a survivor and played all ends against the middle. I don't know. Don't know.
No, I don't know if we'll ever really know, but they are fascinating characters. But Coco Chanel actually used to go, well, there was a Count Vilsek and an sorry, there was an Austrian count, Count Vilsek, who was helping to shelter Jews in Austria in the second, just up in the years leading up to the Second World War, from 1938 to the Second World War, and he sheltered them during the Second World War itself, and ended up in abject poverty. Really, he lost all his money supporting all these people and our agents. But he used to go to some of the parties in Paris that were thrown by Coco Chanel. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, maybe he was spying on her, or maybe she was really working for us. So we don't really know, do we?
Well, I was surprised at how much still isn't revealed because I'm not sure what national security purpose it serves having these secrets. And I think you mentioned Blunt. We still don't know
Yes.
how many people Blunt betrayed. Is that
No.
right?
Yes. I mean, there's so much we don't know exactly what he betrayed. We have an idea from some of the aspects of the Venona Code that's been declassified, the files relating to that. But we don't, any of those Cambridge spies, we don't really know how much they gave, what exactly they gave. There are supposed to be the proof of what they gave up in archives in Russia. Probably not a good idea to be digging around in Russian archives at the
Not right
moment.
now. No, I wouldn't recommend it.
So
Golly,
I think there's a lot of mirrors, and I think that's the intriguing part for all of us. I continue
it
to
is. But also, you show in the book how these remarkable women that you highlight seem particularly well equipped to navigate their way through this world of mirrors and shadows.
yeah, and I think that could well be because they are invisible to everyone. And particularly to the Germans, they were invisible because of that perception of women being the homemaker, being at home. And if they're wandering around, out of the house, they're going shopping, they're going to go and visit a relative, they're going to pick up a child, whatever it is. They don't think of women being involved in the intelligence. And it looks like, to go back to your question about Germany, from the little I have looked at, it looks like Germany didn't use their women embedded across uniform services at all. So it's the perception
Well,
of
Hitler probably thought it was wrong to, he liked these women back home having babies for the fatherland, didn't he? That was his.
that true. I mean, you do have some, obviously, that are working, and you have those couple of ace pilots, experimental pilots that my colleague Claire Mully writes about, the women who flew for Hitler. But they seem to be quite rare. Whereas for us, the women are just embedded everywhere.
No, I think it's probably a sign that a more open-minded society actually has an advantage in an intelligence war. And you're right about the invisibility. Going back to the First World War, I love the stories of all these women on their bicycles, kind of pottering around. German base here, ammunition dump there. Just kind of having a look, and the German soldiers kind of waving.
Yes.
And not realizing that later that day she'd be sending a telegram secret cable, and
Yeah.
the British and the French would know exactly where the Germans were.
Yeah, volumes of intelligence they were passing through to the Allies, and in some cases knitting what they're seeing into coded messages, or coding it into their jumpers and their scarves, that they're just happily sat outside their cottages knitting. All ages these women were, right up into their 80s. That is for me one of the favourite stories. I think that's one that everybody loves.
I do love that. I do
Innocent
love the First
women.
World War stuff, actually. I mean, I love all of it, but that felt very fresh to me.
It is, and it's not, none of this has really been written about before. And that's what I thought was extraordinary, and why I thought I should write the book. Because if you'd interviewed me 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said, no, I'm carrying on with the basic, the wider espionage, military intelligence. I'm not going to focus on just the men or just the women. But there was that moment when I thought, no, so much of this, I don't think people will uncover. Other historians wouldn't uncover the female interrogators. That took 20, 25 years of specialist work on the whole eavesdropping program of World War II, the intelligence gathering through hidden microphones. Well, no one's worked on that material. But as I was working deeper and deeper into it, I discovered that women were doing extraordinary roles in intelligence that were outside the boundaries of anything they'd ever done before.
Incredible.
It is incredible.
So, last question. I mean, all this, you've immersed yourself in this world. Did it change the way you thought about the war more generally? The stories that you told and the stories that you researched and the lives you unearthed?
I think it has, actually. No one's asked me that before, but it has. It's made me super excited and inspirational. I've tried not to be too lively on your podcast today. I'm normally bouncing around.
Oh, we love bouncing around. Bounce away.
And they are just extraordinary. And you look at what they've uncovered in terms of intelligence, and you think, wow, I mustn't spill what's coming in my next book, but I've just uncovered the fact that a major piece of intelligence was uncovered by a woman behind enemy lines. And I'm thinking, wow, she probably just casually thought, well, there's this and that, and they knew what they had to look for. But you're thinking, wow, we've got to get all of these stories, irrespective of gender, we've got to get all of these stories down, work on what's being declassified, be thankful for what we have. And I know we don't have a complete picture, but to start telling these stories. And I'm really heartened that there are so many contemporary historians today that really are diving into the archives. They're not just regurgitating the old stuff and putting in a couple of new letters. That's gone. That age is gone. They really are doing the legwork. And we're getting some extraordinary stories coming out, and they will have appeared, no doubt, on your podcast.
Well, I'm hoping when your next book comes, you'll return and tell us all about it. But thank you so much for this, because this was really good fun.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Helen. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Old Helen, wasn't that great? That was that's what I like. I like stories and people that want to tell stories with passion and enthusiasm, and they don't come much more passionate or enthusiastic than Helen. She's found some amazing things, and you can get a sense of her energy in her book too. I really recommend it. And I should remind you, you can buy all the books that we mentioned here on our own little bookshop. It's in the bio of the program. They cost about the same as Amazon. The only difference is the profits go to podcasters, independent bookshops. So it's like an alternative network for people who don't have the Jeff Bezos advertising dollars. And you can buy any book. I mean, like, there are tens of thousands on there. So if you fancy trying Helen's book, maybe try looking on the Scandal Mongers podcast. And while you're the Scandal Mongers podcast bookshop, I should say, and while you're at it and you're thinking of Christmas, we've had a few more sales of our own. I haven't got my mug. It's a mug. Better mugs are available. So you can buy mugs, you can buy t-shirts of the Scandal Mongers as well. Perfect Christmas presents. I was thinking while I was away that my little introductory remarks where I talk about groupthink and what's happened in my industry and things that aren't talked about at these kind of big conferences where, writers and opinion makers and documentary producers meet. And there's another one I should have mentioned, and I think it was also slightly relevant to the election in America, and that's trans rights. Do you remember the Hannah Barnes program? One of our more interesting. Hannah's story, is so much of our time. She's a journalist with a science background. She gets the sense that there's something happening in this Tavistock clinic that isn't right, speaks to whistleblowers, many of whom are gay or trans themselves, all who believe in the idea of trans healthcare and in trans rights. But they feel that there's been almost like a kind of institutional capturing by people influenced by lobby groups, especially this group Mermaids, who are now under investigation, and that this affirmation model was being applied to children, almost always young girls, teenage girls, having gender dysmorphia, and that they're being kind of rushed along a path towards puberty blockers and then surgeries and life-changing treatments, and they're being rushed along it too quickly, and the evidence for this is not strong enough. And Hannah's work really did make a big difference, and it was connected to this CAS report, and it's probably changed the way the whole world looks at this subject. And never once has she ever been phobic about anybody. She completely believes trans people exist, have rights, and that in many cases, surgeries, drugs are incredibly helpful, life-changing, affirming for people. Never once has she said any of that is wrong. But she said this in this instance with these children, we've rushed ahead. It's all gone a bit. It's a scandal. And it is a scandal. And the other part of it that is a scandal is that her book was turned down by 27 publishers. Even some of them wanted it, but the junior staff thought it was transphobic. Can't publish that. It's transphobic. It'll be a phobe. Got to be a phobe. But that wasn't what she was about. It wasn't what her book was about. And you should listen to the interview. You can see in her, here's somebody from an impeccable BBC background. She's friends with Emily Maitlis, all the kind of BBC lefties. Sorry, but they are. They're investigative journalists. They kick against the pricks. They take on the Tories. They are card-carrying members of the liberal establishment, if you like. But even with that background, there are some stories that you can't touch. Or you can't tell that story because that would, what would it do? It would trouble the consensus that we all live in. It would make us all feel a bit uncomfortable, which is what journalists should do, always. So do listen to Hannah's interview. It's so interesting. But trans, Tavistock, very big story. Has that been mentioned at this conference that I talked about? Well, I haven't actually checked, but I've got various friends who I do know who've told me that it hasn't. I haven't been for several years. But it's another example of why we're not addressing big stories, because they make us feel ideologically uncomfortable. And I did read somewhere that one of the most impactful adverts that Trump made was about women's sports. And that seems to be another example of where the left's got itself so out of kilter with mainstream opinion. Most people aren't phobes. Most people want to love and support trans people. Wear what you like, love who you like, marry who you like. But there is an inevitable clash between their rights and women's rights and women's protections, which have developed over many years for very good reasons. And look what happened in Scotland. And that, this is almost like a sort of pre-echo perhaps of what's happened in America. In Scotland, the same organisations seem to have captured the government and the prison service, and rapists who had no history of any interest in being trans, who are tattooed large men who've raped and hurt and frightened women, having been convicted of that, saying, oh, actually, no, I'm actually a woman. So I need to go into the women's prison, please. It's obviously a lie. It was obviously just a scam to get an easier treatment and maybe also to get access to yet more victims. So women naturally said, this is wrong. It has to stop J.K. Rowling, one of her things that got her involved in what she's doing. And they were demonized. I mean, the people came out and said they're fascists, the normal stuff, chanting black masks, fascists, shut up, you're phobic. How did the left find itself on the side of a rapist wanting to be in a woman's prison? How did that happen? And somehow it's connected to the fact that Hannah couldn't get her book published. Groupthink. Yeah? Well, the warm bath, what everybody else thinks. I don't want to get out of my warm bath. Thank you very much. It's nice and warm in here. Don't be troubled by anybody else's opinion. Really bad. And so I'm sure Trump's motives were totally opportunistic. But apparently the soccer mums of America saw these ads about, women's sports. And it probably affects like a fraction of 0.000. It's a tiny issue. But it just signals that we can listen to you and the Democrats don't. I don't know. Wish nothing but solidarity and support for trans people. I also think that there are some boundaries that need to be very carefully navigated. I mean, at least we should talk about this. Who gets into what bathroom or what prison? And it's all fine if you've got you've actually got a diagnosis or you've had some treatment, but nobody can just rock up, because there are predators in our world. There are predators who will take advantage, like those Scottish rapists did. And you shouldn't have to put your career at risk by saying something as obvious as that rapists shouldn't be in that prison. I mean, Rowling's too big to worry, but there are other people who were genuinely lost their jobs and cancelled over saying these pretty sensible things. Sorry, this is the first post-interview rant. It's not a rant, I was just thinking about it. that there's a connection, I think, to what we're seeing in America, to that story in Scotland, to Hannah's book, to a kind of cultural realignment that I think is maybe the hidden story of what this election. And the left can recover its position. It should. I think the world needs a strong Democratic Party. And God knows, I wouldn't like to see Trump in power forever, or people like Trump. But I think the left have to listen to what regular people care about and not demonize them for that, because a lot of it is actually quite sensible. All right, definitely the end of the rant now. Thank you for watching. Please keep liking and subscribing and commenting. Lots to comment about this week. I'll see you all in the comments. Next week, I think we're still going to be in World War II. I've got another Churchill. I'm not, World War II, Churchill, not. So we're talking about Churchill's bandits next week, unless anything else happens. A really interesting interview about that, about the crazy, scandalous men around Churchill. They were mostly men. And the rather shocking stories, actually, of how some of the big policy decisions at that time were basically, brainstormed at 2 a.m. drinking sessions. But that's all part of the charm of Churchill. Anyway, more about that next week. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you then. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.